So now we've moved out of the introduction to the story of God, and we're starting into the different signs of the Mazzaroth, and we're going to take them sequentially to tell the story of God in the way that it's actually written in the constellations, and that means starting with the Mazzaroth sign of Virgo. And just to show you the big picture before we get started, this is where we are and where we're going. That's just a table of the different Mazzaroth signs and the dates that they fall on this year. Remember, the dates will change from year to year because the calendar that we use in modern times is not the same calendar that God instituted back when he gave the feast days and the civil calendar to the Jews. But if you look at the dates there and just do some quick mental calculations, you'll realize that some of these Mazzaroth signs actually take up more time than others on the calendar. For example, as we start into Virgo, Virgo lasts for 6 different weeks, or 6 weekends, I guess was probably a better way to say it. And that means that we have a fair amount of time to talk about the story of Abraham up till the time when we get to the sign of Libra, where we start talking about Moses and the Exodus. But the average is about 4 weeks, and that gives us plenty of time for each different part of the story to talk about the main concepts or the main aspects and characters of each one. But it certainly means that we won't be going line for line for the most part through any of these different signs. Now we're going to talk in a little bit how we know that the Mazzaroth, or the story of God, actually starts with Virgo. Because if you remember the Mazzaroth, or the zodiac, I prefer the word Mazzaroth because that's what's actually used in the book of Job. The Mazzaroth is a circle. So the first question we have to deal with actually is, where do we start? I mean, ideally, you tell any story from the beginning straight through until the end. Well, if you look at the Mazzaroth that I have here up on the screen, if you're watching a video instead of just listening to audio, I've placed Virgo right at the top. I've just kind of spun it around. And the sign right before Virgo is Leo. And Leo actually is the end of the story when Christ returns to claim his inheritance. And then right after Virgo is Libra. So the top 3 signs going from right to left are actually Libra, Virgo, and then Leo. And of course, Libra representing the Mosaic Law, the covenant in the Old Testament. Now, what's really cool about these 3 different signs taken together and being located right next to each other on the Mazzaroth circle itself is that if we start at Libra and we work backwards from Libra to Virgo to then Leo, those 3 constellation signs by themselves tell the entire story in short form. Right? We've been talking this whole time about how the Mazzaroth tells the story of God, and you would imagine that you need all 12 signs to tell the entire story once we're on the other side of the flood. But in reality, those three signs, Libra, Virgo, and Leo, give a very big overview of the entire story. Now, if you remember in the introduction, we talked about how God cursed the creation in Genesis chapter 3, and even though we didn't go into details, we do that in other lessons and other sermons, we know that God limited the curse to 6,000 years, or 120 different Jubilee cycles. God said back in Genesis 6, he said, "My breath will not at all reside among these humans for very long because they are flesh, but their days will be 120 years. And he's talking specifically about the 50th Jubilee cycle as part of God's timekeeping system. And 120 times 50 just happens to be exactly 6,000 years. We also know that the fall and the curse happened on day 10 of creation, day 10 of pretty much that entire 6,000 years. And really what that means is that the entire 6,000 year period of time between the fall of man and the return of Christ, the time that is represented in this short story form by the sign of Libra, it's all about the curse and the bondage of sin, right? The 6,000 year period of the curse is talking about the bondage of sin, as well as the laws or the rules that mankind has had to follow in order to be spared judgment, or to say it another way, to be in good standing with God. And God has always communicated his rules. He's always been very transparent about what he requires of his people, and for the most part, he's done all of that communication in the form of covenants. And the covenants is really what Virgo represents. right? But we understand that the Abrahamic covenant, which is the topic of Virgo, is actually not the first covenant. The first covenant would have started with Adam and Eve, where God told them not to eat of the tree of knowing what is known to be good, what is, don't eat of the tree of knowing what is to be known of good and evil. And basically, the conditions were you can have free reign of the garden that I've made for you, and you can eat of everything except that one tree. And as long as you obey by my rules, you stay in the garden, you live in a perfect world, and you can live in harmony with me. We can talk and walk as we walk around the garden, and you'll be able to eat of the tree of eternal life. Well, of course, they fell from that. But then there were the rules that God gave Cain and Abel, right? When he told them about how he wanted to be honored with the fruits of their labor. And he said to Cain, he said, if you do well, will you not also be approved? And then there was the Noahic covenant, where God promised never to flood the earth again. And he gave Noah and his descendants some new rules and some new guidelines. But nevertheless, while we say that Virgo refers specifically to the Abrahamic covenant, in a very, very large sense, it represents the fact that while the creation is under the curse, God has always set clear rules and clear guidelines that allow us to be reconciled to Him. And that both within and outside of the Abrahamic covenant, God has always pointed His people towards Leo, the Messiah who would return to remove the curse and to restore all of creation. And so again, these three Mazzaroth signs tell the entire story by themselves. Libra representing the curse of man for the 6,000 years, Virgo representing the covenant that God has had with His people in different forms, the laws and the rules that we have to abide by, and then ultimately everything is pointing towards the return of the King. Now, what might be even more interesting than that is that Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated, while representing the anniversary of creation, the beginning of the civil calendar of the new year per God, as well as the birth of Christ, which we'll talk more about when we get to the constellation of Aries. Over the last 6,000 years, Rosh Hashanah has sometimes fallen on the calendar in the sign of Libra, sometimes in the sign of Virgo, and sometimes in the sign of Leo. And basically, it's bounced around. In the last 5,982 years since creation, the sun has risen on Rosh Hashanah within either one of those three constellations, and it would never have strayed outside of those three. Now, there are a couple of different reasons for that. The first reason is that there's a difference between dates on solar and lunar calendars. So we have a solar-based calendar that's courtesy of Pope Gregory VIII, which I believe he gave to us towards the end of the 16th century, somewhere around 1580, if I remember correctly. But God's calendar, including the feast day calendar, is lunar. It's based on the cycles of the new moon rather than based on solar. And that's why none of God's feast days are ever on the same calendar day from year to year for you and I. For example, Rosh Hashanah itself can vary from mid-September to mid-October. Passover is always on a different calendar date, but it always falls somewhere in between the end of March and the beginning of April. So that's one reason why Rosh Hashanah tends to bounce around a little bit. However, the second reason, and probably the most important one, is something called precession. Precession is a phenomena where a rotating object tends to actually wobble around its axis. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, and I'm certainly no expert, so please forgive me if I explain this just a little bit poorly. I remember when I was a kid, I had a gyroscope, one of those spinning tops, and you wound it up with something, and you pull the string, and inside this disc would spin, and literally, if you spun it fast enough, you could balance it on the tip of your finger, and it would stay perfectly still. And I would love to watch that thing spin around, but what ended up happening was as it slowed down, invariably it would tilt, and then it would start to wobble, and of course it would fall off my finger or fall on the floor, just depending on what I had it put on, but nevertheless, as it tilted, it would start to wobble like crazy. And if you've ever played with a gyroscope, you know that as long as it spins quickly, and as long as the axis around which the gyroscope is spinning is perfectly vertical, it's going to stay in one place. Or to say it another way, it has absolutely no wobble if it's perfectly vertical. But if it's tilted like the Earth is, if you remember in the introduction, we talked about how the axis of the Earth is tilted right at about 23.5 degrees. If a gyroscope is tilted like the Earth, the wobble that results from the tilt actually is shaped like a cone. And again, if you're watching the video, you can see the video that's playing on the screen there, and you can see that the bottom of the gyroscope is fixed in one place, but the very top is going around in a circle. And so if you could trace that out, kind of like one of those old spirographs, you'd notice that it was the shape of a cone. Right? The bottom stays put while the top actually spins around in a circular path that's fixed around that point on the bottom. Now, one of the cool things is that the taller the spinning top is, the larger the circle is at the top of the wobble. Or again, to say it another way, the greater the distance between the top and the bottom of a spinning object, the longer it takes for the top part to actually make it all the way around the circle of the wobble one time, because the circle is bigger as the object gets bigger, or as the top and the bottom of the axis get further and further apart. So if we take that idea and we apply it to the Earth, as far as the Earth is concerned, based on the size of the planet, which is quite large, and the speed of rotation, which is quite fast, and the fact that the Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees, the Earth actually has a wobble. And scientists have calculated that it would take the Earth, based on the size of the Earth, the speed of the rotation, and the tilt, it would take about 26,000 years for the Earth to complete one entire wobble. Just one, 26,000 years. Now, if the Bible is correct, and I believe it is, and the timeline that says that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, I guess we're just getting started, right? The wobble is only barely just begun for us. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because it has an impact in what the stars in the sky look like over time. Quite literally, the wobble of the Earth's rotation changes how the stars appear to us on Earth at different times in history. And this, again, is important as we start to talk about the star signs that represent the story of God. Now, what this means is that the angle of the ecliptic, remember the word ecliptic refers to the angle that the sun and the constellations will track from, let's just talk about the sun, the angle the sun will take from sunrise to sunset, right? It's not perfectly vertical over us. Well, first of all, we're in the northern hemisphere, and that makes a difference. But the fact that the Earth is tilted gives us this kind of angular arc that the constellations as well as the sun prescribes as it goes across from sunrise to sunset. So the path that the sun and the constellations take in the sky at any given moment depends on this concept of precession, right? The ecliptic actually changes that angle that the sun and the constellations go across the sky actually changes from year to year and century to century. Of course, over centuries, it's going to change a little bit more than what it would from year to year. So the average position of the sun when it rises on Rosh Hashanah has changed over time. If we could go travel back in time, 3,000 years, and we could look at the sunrise and the constellations on Rosh Hashanah on that given year, the sky would actually look different than what we can observe today if we were looking at it particularly from a fixed position, like from Jerusalem. If there was no wobble to the Earth at all, if the Earth was perfectly vertical and it didn't wobble at the top, then the sun would rise in a single constellation all the time. But sometimes it would rise in the beginning of the constellation, sometimes towards the end in terms of the calendar dates. But again, we have to factor in the fact that the lunar and the solar cycles are different anyways. Now, this is where it gets super cool. Back at the time of creation, literally year zero, the way that we keep track of time, or year number one if you are using inclusive reckoning, which is common to the Eastern and the Asian cultures. At the very first Rosh Hashanah, very first day of creation, during the Genesis 1 account, what you're looking at on the screen is what the sky would have looked like if you were looking east from Jerusalem on what we would have called October 14th in the year zero Anno Mundi, or zero of the first day of creation. Now, what you can see there is you can see the new moon right next to Virgo's left hand, and you can see the sun rising at the very top of the constellation Libra, almost just to the left, again, of the screen, just looking straight east. You can see the sunrise, and that's actually the top of Libra, the symbol of the scales. Now, you can use an astronomy program like I have here, and you can actually spin the clock forward and backward as much as you want. You can say, how does the sky look like 5 seconds from now, 5 minutes from now, 5 years from now, 5,000 years from now? Or you can go backwards. You can spin the clock forwards or backwards to any time and any place and any location and any perspective. And the program will show you exactly what the sun, the moon, and the stars and the constellations were doing, have done, or will do in the future. Again, on any day, any time of day, any date during any year, looking in any direction from any spot on Earth. And that's because the movements of the Earth and the moon in their orbits against the backdrop of the constellations. Remember, we're moving, they're not, but they appear to be moving because we can't discern our own movement. But basically, these movements are mathematically precise, and they are known and have been known for a very long time. In fact, this entire idea of precession, about how the fabric of the stars the orientation has changed slightly from year to year. This idea of precession was discovered by a Greek astronomer named Hipparchus of Nicaea, and that was around 150 BC, just a couple hundred. In fact, it was around the time, just a little bit after the time of the Maccabean revolt, actually, if we're looking at the dates. And what Hipparchus did was he compared his observations of the stars to the written record of earlier astronomers. And he noticed that his calculations were different, or his positions of the stars were different, but they were only off just by a degree or two. And that's in comparison to the writings of a century or so before, but it was enough for him to notice, and it was enough for him to actually calculate accurately. So in the very beginning, on Rosh Hashanah, the sun rose in Libra. That constellation that in the bigger picture represents the curse and the bondage of sin. Remember, in the smaller, more precise picture, Libra is very, very specific. It's about the Exodus and the law that was given at Mount Sinai. But if we consider that Libra, Virgo, and Leo tell the entire story just by themselves, then Libra represents the 6,000-year period of curse. And so back in Rosh Hashanah, the stars told the beginning of the story, that there was a curse placed upon the earth. And there's a beautiful synchrony to this, isn't there? God didn't just put the story in the stars, he synced it to a timeline. And then over the centuries, because of precession, the sun stopped rising predominantly in Libra, and it actually began to rise more often in Virgo. And then every once in a while it would rise in Libra. And so if we spun the clock forward then and looked at sunrise on Rosh Hashanah, the sky would look like this. And in fact, this, what you're looking at here on the screen, is what the morning sky would have looked like looking to the east from Jerusalem on Rosh Hashanah, the year that Christ was born. Right? This is the morning sky about 8 o'clock on Rosh Hashanah, September 22nd, 4 BC, which is what we calculate to be the birthday of Christ. And if you've been tracking with the BBI lessons in Revelation 12 recently, you'll recognize that this constellation shows a woman with the moon at her feet and being clothed with the sun. And this matches perfectly what John witnessed in the sky in Revelation chapter 12. That year, the sun rose on Rosh Hashanah in Virgo, which is the symbol of God's promises and covenant of redemption that spans all the way from Genesis 3:15 to the end of the book of Revelation. And what we see over the first few thousand years again, is that in the beginning of time, in the beginning of the 6,000 year period, the sun rose on Rosh Hashanah more often in Libra than anywhere else, sometimes in Virgo. Then after a couple of thousand years, it rose mostly in Virgo and only sometimes in Libra. And then as we get closer to the time of Christ, the sun rose in Rosh Hashanah more often in Leo. Right? In other words, the average sunrise of Rosh Hashanah has progressed from Libra to Virgo, then to Leo. And in fact, this year on Rosh Hashanah, the sun did rise on Rosh Hashanah in Leo. This is what it looked like if you were looking east from Jerusalem in the morning on Rosh Hashanah of 2018. So remember that Rosh Hashanah bounces around in our calendar. Actually, it's probably better to say that our calendar bounces around Rosh Hashanah, because God is really the focal point of that. Nevertheless, if we calculate the average date that Rosh Hashanah has fallen on over the years, and we look at the first part of the 6,000 year period we're in, early on it fell most often during Libra, proclaiming on Rosh Hashanah the part of the story that says, hey, we live in a cursed creation, right? And there are rules that God uses to govern and teach his people. But toward the middle of the 6,000 years, Rosh Hashanah sunrise proclaimed the story that was most consistent with Virgo, the claim of God's plan for redemption, specifically the Abrahamic covenant, but basically it's God's chosen methodology to deliver the Messiah. And finally, in the last part of the 6,000 years, as we move into our modern age and closer to the kingdom, Rosh Hashanah has often and more frequently will rise during or in the constellation of Leo. And what will happen in the future, once we're actually in the kingdom, is Rosh Hashanah will fall predominantly in the sign of Leo. So again, the first day of God's year has always fallen in one of three constellations: Libra, Virgo, or Leo, spending more or less time in a given sign depending on where we are in that 6,000 year period. But these three signs by themselves have continued to proclaim the entire story every year, specifically on Rosh Hashanah. Now, Caleb asked me this question last week after our last lesson. He was thinking about some of the things that we had talked about, and he asked me if I thought that when the Father on creation, during the creation week, when the Father directed the Son during the creation days, he asked me if I thought whether or not the Son knew that he was writing his own story in the stars. Intriguing question, and I have to admit, I don't know. We're not told, and certainly there are some things I'm okay speculating with and others not. But that is a very intriguing question. Now, let's go back to our circle. And let's talk about where the story begins and how we can find the entry point. Of course, you and I have hindsight, right? Because we look at the Bible, we see how the story starts and ends. Once we get through the introduction, and that brings us up past the Tower of Babel, the story of God really begins when he calls Abraham or Abram out of paganism to establish a covenant with him, right? At the very least, we can look at verses that we see in Genesis chapter 49. We can look at Revelation chapter 5, where there are references, especially in Revelation 5, to Jesus as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And we can conclude just by looking at that Leo is the end, because at some point the lion's coming back. And so we can look at Leo as the end and then work our way back around to Virgo. Or we can, again, look at the very first event in the post-flood, post-Tower of Babel world, and know that it was when God called Abraham or Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, and he made him some promises. And then we can take that as the starting point and work forward all the way back around to looking at Leo again. So certainly there are some biblical clues, but are there any clues in the Mazzaroth itself? Or maybe even better, are there clues in the ancient world that could potentially help us? Now, do you remember Ham's son Mizraim? He was the one who was also called Egypt. And when the Tower of Babel event happened, he and his people went southwest to the region of the Nile and settled in there, and they founded the first Egyptian civilization or settlements. And they took with them the mythology of Nimrod and Semiramis. But Of course, they had their own spin on things. And so ancient Egyptian mythology is similar to, but a little bit different than what we see with the Babylonians, etc. But also remember, our contention and belief that it was Noah who was the conduit to bring the pre-flood knowledge of the stars and the story of God, from Sept to Enosh all the way down to Noah and Shem. Noah and his sons took the story of the Mazzaroth across the flood to the New World, and it's that Semiramis used to create her own original Babylonian paganism, what became the origin or the source of all pagan belief systems. So again, do we see anything in either ancient Babylonian or Egyptian mythology that even hints at where to start when we look at the story of God after the flood happened? Now, it's not my intent to rehash the whole Mazzaroth study, but there are two indicators that tell us Virgo is the right starting point. And Tim points these out in his book, which is called the Mazzaroth, the Gospel and the Stars. The first indicator is the Great Sphinx in Egypt, in Giza. The Sphinx is an ancient mythical creature that has a lion's body and a woman's head, and the Sphinx is actually perfectly oriented towards the ecliptic several times per year. It lines up perfectly. If you could draw a line down the back of the lion's body and up the top and the middle of the woman's head, and you kept going forward, you would actually hit the ecliptic perfectly. And specifically, I shouldn't say it's that all time because things change, right? During the summer and the winter solstices, these are the times where we see in the summer the longest day of the year, and the winter the shortest. So typically June 21st and December 21st. During these summer and winter solstices, specifically at noon and midnight, so noon in the summer at June 21st and midnight on the winter solstice in December 21st, is when the Sphinx lines up exactly with the ecliptic. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. The ecliptic doesn't change that much from year to year in the Sphinx, but I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots that on these particular times of the day, and it's not just the winter and the summer solstices, it's also during the spring and the fall equinoxes when the day and the night are of equivalent length, and that's typically in the third week of March and September. Now, to be able to take a structure as large as the Sphinx and make the calculations, and basically it's a remarkable feat of astronomy and math and engineering as well as construction, right? Just in and of itself, it's an amazing feat to get it to line up to a specific point. But, if we look at it, it's not hard to see that the Sphinx is a single creature with Leo and Virgo blended together. Now, that's not the only clue. Take a look at this. This is the eastern sky at midnight during the winter solstice, again, December 21st. And this is one of the key times that the Sphinx, aligns specifically with the ecliptic. And if you look at that, what's staring right back at you? It's the constellation Virgo. If you were looking at the sky just a few months after Adam and Eve fell and were evicted from the garden, because I set the time frame on this to actually look back at the winter solstice in the first year of creation. Right? But the truth is that we could spin that clock, and as long as we kept it on December 21st and we looked at the night sky at midnight, every single year from the year of creation to where we are today, the Sphinx looks straight up into the sky at midnight on the winter solstice. And what you see is the constellation of Virgo. You see Libra at her feet just below her, and right above her, you see the constellation of Leo, starting to mix them together. Or to say it another way, at that specific time, every single year from creation forward, the Sphinx always points to the constellations of Libra on the bottom, Virgo in the middle, and then Libra on the top. And it also happens at noon during the summer solstice. This is the midday sky, and it's the same story, right? You just need to know when to look, right? This is noon on June 21st, the year after creation started, or the first year of creation. But remember that because of precession, the sky picture drifts over time. In fact, the closer we get to the return of the Lord, the more of Leo that we start seeing at midnight during the winter solstice. So here we have what the midnight sky looks like on December 21st in the year 2036. You can see compared to the last picture, let me go back two more. Here you see predominantly, you see a little bit of Libra above the horizon. You see mostly Virgo. But if we go forward to 2036, you see above the horizon is just the head and the shoulders of Virgo, and you see mostly Leo. It's almost as if time itself is pointing us to a very specific part of the story, right? Now, this again is winter solstice in the year 2036. And that would be a couple of months after the Day of Atonement. So if I back up the camera, or not the camera, the time frame just a couple of months to the Day of Atonement in 2036, this is what the morning sky would look like on the Day of Atonement 2036. In fact, the date is October 1st. October 1st, 2036 is when the Day of Atonement will happen, right? And that, honestly, is the last Day of Atonement we will ever see, because we're not going to be observing the day of the Day of Atonement in the kingdom, as far as we can tell, right? So I think it's pretty obvious that this is where the story begins. It starts with Virgo, it ends with Leo, the return of the king, and I think it is just absolutely astonishing that you see this recurring picture over and over again at key times, right? With on Rosh Hashanah every single year, in the beginning of the 6,000 year period, it's rising often in Libra, representing, hey, the place with the whole world we've lived in and ourselves were cursed. And then as we progress to the middle of the 6,000 years, it rises in Virgo, saying, don't fret, there are rules. If you follow these, you can be in covenant with God. And then towards the end of the 6,000 years on Rosh Hashanah, the sun rises more often in Leo. And then we have the Sphinx oriented to the ecliptic. And on key times during the year, when either days are long or short, or where they're actually equal, then it keeps pointing to the same story. Now, there are a lot of Christians who recognize that God created astronomy and that Satan created astrology, and we are to stay away from astrology, the idea that the stars can determine our fates or at least allow us to predict them. But even among the Christians who understand that God created the stars and the constellations, there's not universal agreement in this group of believers about what the different symbols mean, right? It's not something that Tim made up or we've made up. In fact, over the years, there have been several books, a small handful of books that have been published trying to weave the story of the stars together. But unfortunately, in their bid to try to make sense of the constellations, they actually rely quite a bit on allegory and opinion. And I think what Tim did, what Tim did that was different was he said, if there is a story in the stars, and if God himself imprinted his own story on creation itself, we shouldn't have to make stuff up. We shouldn't have to, rely on anything subjective to tell the tale. The Bible should explain things directly to us, and it should do so without us having to twist or massage things into place to make the pieces all fit together. So we can dispense with opinions that, for example, Virgo is a very common opinion that Virgo represents the Virgin Mary. We can get rid of that altogether, because the one thing that it does is it disjoints the story. The story is told in sequence, beginning and middle and end. And if we were to accept this idea that Virgo represents the Virgin Mary, then it would make things out of order, right? And we can't do that because God himself set the order in the stars. And he tells the story again from beginning to the middle to the end. Now here is a picture. It's an older image that you see with a lot of different, of course, there's so many different ways to represent the constellation these days, but this is, some older art. Now, I've already stated, and I think most of you know, especially in our local fellowship, that Virgo represents Sarah as a specific biblical figure, but in a larger sense, she represents the entire Abrahamic covenant, the plan that God set in motion to deliver us from the curse of man's disobedience. Now, recently in our Bereans lessons, again, Tim in Revelation 12 has spent a lot of time showing us how the constellation Virgo is noted and seen by John in Revelation 12 is consistent with the story of Sarah and Hagar in Genesis. And, this is all expounded on by Paul in Galatians chapter 3 and 4, where Sarah is equated with the higher Jerusalem and those whose citizenship is found within her. So we're not going to repeat all that, but if that's all news to you, there's places that you can go to understand that, specifically the lessons in the Bereans Bible Institute on the Four Winds Fellowship website, specifically for Revelation chapter 12. But the Bible is very clear that Sarah is the mother of us all, as Paul calls her, and she's called that because of the nature of God's promises, the promises that God made to Abraham. But honestly, before we can even get into that part of the story, we need to look at what we know about Abraham. What do we know about him in the time that God, like in and around the time at and before God called him out of the city of Ur? Because when you look at Genesis, the story picks up when Abraham was 75 years old and he was already married. So it skips a lot of time and it skips a lot of detail. Now, again, if you're watching the video, this is a map of the Middle East that shows how different kingdoms controlled the Middle East at different time periods, but you can see that there's a line that goes from the bottom right up to the middle and then down to the left again. And that represents some of the journeys of Abraham. Again, the story post-flood, everything begins with Abraham. Of course, his name was Abram at the time. We'll explain that a little bit later. But he was born in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia, and that's the same land of Shinar that we saw earlier in Genesis, where the people settled after the flood. And when we get a little further into the story of Virgo, we'll track Abraham from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt and back to Canaan and so on. Now, the Bible really doesn't give us any backstory for Abraham or Abram other than to give his genealogy. And I want to point out, because I think it's important to point out that depending on which source text you read, you will see different ages in different Bibles for the genealogies listed from Noah to Abram. Because there's argument not just among different Christian scholars about which genealogy is correct. Atheists like to point out that there is a contradiction. Hey, depending on which Bible, you get one date or one age for one person and something different. And so depending on which Bible you read, you come up with a different list of genealogies in a different time frame. So they like to point that out as a contradiction as well as a reason to disbelieve. So I want to show it to you. And here's a table actually with the different genealogies. This is a screenshot actually from somebody else's work. I didn't put this together. But this shows the ages of Noah, from Noah to Abram, from three different sources. We have the ages that are listed from the Hebrew Old Testament, what's also called the Masoretic text. We have in the middle the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then on the right we have the Greek Septuagint. Now, as a general rule, if there is a difference between the readings of a particular verse in the Old Testament and there's a disagreement between, say, the Hebrew Old Testament, which is what most Bibles are based on, and what we see in the Greek Septuagint, typically we tend to prefer the Septuagint because, quite honestly, if it was good enough for Christ, it's good enough for us. Jesus himself, as well as his apostles, quoted extensively from the Greek version of the Bible. They didn't quote from the Hebrew Old Testament. In fact, the Septuagint is about 12 to 1300 years older than the earliest copy of the Hebrew Old Testament, which is called the Leningrad Codex. And again, as a general rule, we believe that some aspects of the Hebrew Old Testament, I have to emphasize that, were probably altered by the Jews after Christ's resurrection to de-emphasize any verse that may point to the conclusion that Jesus actually was the Messiah. However, when it comes to these pre-Abrahamic genealogies, I think we have to be careful. We also have to be careful not to appear to be simply picking and choosing the data we use just to confirm what we already believe to be true. Having said that, we're starting from the position of what's called chiliasm, and that's an ancient word. That's the idea that the 6 days of creation were prophetic, and they represent 6,000 years of human history where God's holy breath would reside among his people, shepherding the faithful, but being patient with the disobedient. And this is the frustration that God expressed in Genesis chapter 6, because his people were constantly disobeying him. Now, this idea of chiliasm in the 6,000 year timetable was the unanimous position of the very early church, but it fell out of favor as false teaching crept in, certainly in the first century and even beyond, after the last apostle John died, right at the turn of the century. So, if we accept chiliasm to be true, and if we understand that we're on a 6,000 year timeline, then that basically gives us an absolute maximum time frame to work with to make sure that any genealogies that we use, any numbers that add up, have to fit within that 6,000 year framework. And if it doesn't, and we continue to believe that chiliasm is accurate and true, then we have to abandon any calculations or any numbers or any translations that actually create a time frame that goes beyond 6,000 years. Now, let me just clean up this chart and take some things away so it's easier to focus on what's important there. What you're looking at right now are the ages of Noah to Abram when the first son of each man was born. If we go down through the genealogies, for example, it would say, that so-and-so was 32 when he had his first son, and then he would name the first son. And then he would say, well, he lived another extra 100 years or 120 years or whatever the case is. And then it switches to the son and says the son was X age when he had his first son, and it just continues to build the genealogy. Now, for the most of them, and again, we're looking at three different sources here. For the most of them, if the Hebrew Old Testament says, for example, that someone was 30 when his first son was born, the Septuagint says that he was 130. If it says that he was 132, if the Hebrew Old Testament says that so-and-so was 32 when he had his first son, the Septuagint says he was 132. In fact, in each of these different disagreements between the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek Septuagint, this is true from looking on the list there from Arphaxad to Sirach. Basically, the Septuagint adds exactly 100 years to each genealogy. And even more than that, the Septuagint adds in an extra generation, another man named Canaan, and that's a different Canaan than the one who was the son of Ham, right? A different line of Noah altogether. And so what this means is where the Septuagint has added 100 years, exactly 100 years to 7 different men, that means there is at least a 700-year difference between the genealogies and the timelines that you can construct using the Hebrew Masoretic text versus using the Greek Septuagint. Now, there's a lot of scholarly debate about why these disagree. And again, why exactly 100 years in every single instance? In fact, I think if the dates were, people were born randomly at different times and men had their first child at random ages, we wouldn't see exactly 100 years being appended or added to each man's genealogy. And why add an extra generation in the figure of this man Canaan? Or really, is it that the Hebrew Old Testament omitted Canaan and reduced the ages by 100 years? Well, several years ago, and I'm not going to try to solve that problem here right now, I'll give you a quick overview. But several years ago, Tim dealt with all of these questions in a written debate with a man named Dr. Leslie McFall, who's a modern biblical chronologist. And McFall read Tim's timeline book, and he had several different problems with his timeline. He wrote this kind of scathing criticism on Amazon, and Tim started dialoguing with him and refuting his criticism. And McFall himself has actually offered his own theories about the timeline, stating things like Moses left major time gaps in the genealogies. He left people out. He didn't report all of Noah's or Shem's descendants and so on. I mean, things that he actually can't prove. But either way, McFall, suggests he had all these different reasons why Tim's timeline was incorrect. But what I want you to know is that Tim has answered all of those criticisms, and that would serve to be our ministry answer to all the criticisms. And if you want to read the paper, you can actually read the debate, and it only went so long because what we see routinely is that people who enter into debate with our ministry end up just falling away anyways. I think there's reasons for that. But if you want to read the article for yourself that Tim wrote, you can find the paper on the fourwoodsfellowships.net website. Go under articles, then biblical chronology, and then look for part 1, Moses' genealogies from Adam to Abraham, right? And Tim outlines all of the arguments. But here's the basic bottom line in what Tim suggested. First of all, is that it is our opinion that when the Jews were asked to translate the Hebrew Old Testament, the original, because remember, the only copy we have is from a little over 1,000 years, like 1,008 years after Christ, right? So when the Jews were asked to translate the original by King Ptolemy, and that was a couple of hundred years before Christ, it's our opinion that the Jews altered the ages to prevent the Gentiles from being able to make their own calculations regarding perhaps the time of creation, maybe even the timing of the predicted Messiah or the prophesied Messiah. Nevertheless, it's our opinion that the Septuagint, the translators, intentionally added these things to misdirect the pagans. Now, nevertheless, we, in this particular instance, accept the Hebrew Old Testament genealogies in the different ages, if only for one reason: it's perfectly consistent with the early church teaching of Chiliasm. And again, if the ages of these men were as the Hebrew Old Testament declare, and then the 6,000-year prophecy works out perfectly, mathematically perfectly. But if not, then the earth is significantly older than what we think. And in fact, the flood didn't happen when we thought it happened. The world would be way past 6,000 years when Christ returns. And in fact, and there are a couple of places where the Septuagint differs, not just in these genealogies, but if you added up all the differences that the Septuagint has, the Septuagint adds well over 1,000 years to the timeline, and we just simply can't accept that because of our solid belief in the 6,000-year prophetic week, or the six days of creation and 6,000 years under the curse. So if the Bible doesn't tell us about the early years of Abram, where can we go to get some background? There's some extra biblical sources that people like to toss around. For example, like the book of Enoch we talked about a couple of lessons ago, which we just don't accept. Another common biblical source, extra biblical source, is called the book of Jubilees. And it's not an inspired work, and it appears to have been written only a couple of hundred years before Christ, so it's not ancient history from the sense of the people of the Jews. But again, it was sometime around the Maccabean revolt where we get the story of Hanukkah. But the book of Jubilees basically paints a story of how Abraham's father, Terah, was a pagan, like probably everyone else at his time, and that at the age of 14, Abram separated himself from his father so he wouldn't fall into idolatry. And then later, when he was married and he was an older man, in stealth, in the cover of night, he burned down a pagan temple. And his brother Haran, according to the book of Jubilees, ran in to save all these pagan idols. And actually, that's where Haran died. He actually died in a fire that Abraham, his brother, had started. Now, none of this, of course, is mentioned in the Bible. It's in the book of Jubilees, so we take it with a grain of salt. So there are other mythical sources, and I think I mentioned these a couple of lessons ago, but basically a couple of mythical sources that say Abram was alive when Nimrod ruled the earth, that they actually warred and fought against each other. And one story says that Terah, Abram's father, was an advisor of Nimrod, and he hid Abram as a newborn because there were some star constellation, something happened that was interpreted as a prophecy saying that a child would be born that would overthrow Nimrod's kingdom. And so Terah hid him in a cave until he was a certain age, and so on. So we kind of refute those, right? We don't accept those. But one source that we go to quite often is the Jewish historian Josephus, right? We find him to be generally reliable. In chapter 7, book 1, I'm just going to quote a paragraph. This is what he says about Abram. It says, "Now Abram, having no son of his own, adopted Lot, his brother Haran's son, and his wife Sarai's brother. And he left the land of Chaldea when he was 75 years old, and at the command of God went into Canaan. And therein he dwelt himself, and left it to his posterity. He was a person of great sagacity or wisdom, both for understanding all things and persuading his hearers, and not mistaken in his opinions, for which reason he began to have higher notions of virtue than others had, and he determined to renew and to change the opinion all men happened then to have concerning God. For he was the first that ventured to publish this notion that there was but one God, the creator of the universe, and that as to other gods, if they contributed anything to the happiness of men, that each of them afforded it only according to his appointment and not by their own power. So, according to Josephus, Abram was an oddity in his time. Josephus goes on to describe how, as a young man, Abram observed the sun and the moon and the stars, and how he concluded that there was one God that created the rules that govern the motions of the planets and the stars. Now, while it seems, according to Josephus's description, while it seems that Abram made room for the possibility of other gods, he put them in subjection to the one true God, the one who created the universe and who set the rules. And it was probably this heart and this predisposition that caused God to choose him out of all people he could have chosen to eventually bring the Christ. And that's really all we know about Abram. That's it. Just a brief description in the Antiquities of the Jews written by Josephus. There's really nothing else, and there's nothing in the Bible. So, having said that, let me just decide if I'm going to go forward. I think I'm going to call it quits there for the moment, and we'll take the rest of it. What we'll do when we come back next week for our lesson is we'll start in Genesis chapter 12. And I've got a few comments to make about the beginning of God's relationship with Abram, and it's some things that we need to take away from that. But hope you found this enjoyable. I just find some of this astronomical information absolutely astounding. And it just deepens my faith in the Lord. It just deepens my faith in how he is control of absolutely everything. And we're on his plan in his time and nothing else. God bless, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.